Cain's story does not end with Abel's blood. That is where most people stop reading. Cain kills his brother, God confronts him, the ground is cursed, and Cain walks away from the presence of the Lord. It feels like the end of the story. The first murderer disappears into exile, and Genesis moves on. But that is not what happens. Genesis keeps following Cain for a few more lines, and the next thing it tells us is almost disturbing. Cain has a son, and Cain builds a city. The first murderer in the Bible becomes the first city builder Genesis ever names. Not a priest, not a king, not a righteous son. Cain. The man who spilled his brother's blood is the man connected to the Bible's first named city. And once you see that, the story becomes much bigger than one brother killing another brother in a field. It becomes a story about what human beings build after they leave Eden. It becomes a story about fear, security, violence, culture, names, cities, and the kind of world that can grow without the presence of God at its center. And the question is not simply, why did Cain kill Abel? The darker question is, what did Cain build after the murder? Because Genesis does not place that city there by accident. To understand the city, we have to return to the field. Cain and Abel are the first brothers in the biblical story. They are born outside Eden, which means they are already living in a world east of the garden, a world where sin, death, pain, and exile have entered human history. Cain works the ground. Abel keeps sheep. Both bring offerings to the Lord. The text does not give us every detail we want. It does not stop to explain every motive, every ritual rule, or every hidden thought. But it tells us enough to see the crisis. The Lord has regard for Abel and his offering, but not for Cain and his offering. Cain becomes very angry, and his face falls. This is the first warning sign. The first murder does not begin with blood. It begins with a heart that refuses correction. Cain is not yet holding a weapon. Abel is not yet dead. But something has already crouched at the door. God speaks to Cain before the murder happens. That matters. God does not wait silently while Cain walks into destruction. He asks, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." This is one of the most frightening images in early Genesis. Sin is pictured almost like a beast waiting at the doorway. Cain is not helpless, but he is in danger. His anger is not just an emotion, it is becoming a doorway, and God warns him before he opens it. But Cain does not listen. He speaks to Abel his brother, and when they are in the field, Cain rises up against Abel his brother and kills him. Genesis says it with almost no decoration, no dramatic speech, no long description, no explanation of the weapon, just the terrible movement. Brother against brother, field, blood, death. The earth that was meant to receive seed now receives Abel's blood, and this is where the story begins to echo Eden. In Eden, God asked Adam, "Where are you?" After the first murder, God asks Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" God's questions in Genesis are never because God lacks information. They expose the human heart. Adam hides from God among the trees. Cain hides from the truth with a question of his own. Am I my brother's keeper? That answer is colder than many people realize. Cain does not simply lie. He rejects responsibility. He speaks as if his brother's life is none of his concern. And that may be the first philosophy of violence in the Bible. I am not responsible for the one beside me. I do not have to guard my brother. I do not have to answer for the blood on the ground. Cain wants to separate himself from the person he has destroyed. But God does not let the blood become silent. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Abel is dead, but Abel's blood speaks. Cain tries to remove his brother from the world, but the ground itself becomes a witness. Then the judgment comes, and it is tied to the ground. That is important, because Cain was a worker of the ground. His identity, labor, food, and future were connected to the soil. But now the ground that opened its mouth to receive Abel's blood from Cain's hand will no longer yield its strength to him. Cain will become a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. The punishment fits the crime in a terrifying way. Cain took Abel's life from the ground, and now the ground will no longer give Cain the stability he knew. He destroyed his brother's place in the world, and now his own place in the world becomes unstable. But listen to Cain's response. He says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." He says he will be hidden from God's face. He will be a fugitive and a wanderer, and whoever finds him will kill him. Cain is afraid. But what exactly is he afraid of? He fears that the violence he released into the world will return to him. He fears becoming the victim of the same kind of bloodshed he committed. The first murderer is suddenly afraid of murder. That is not repentance yet. That is panic. Cain is terrified of consequences, not clearly broken over Abel. But God still places a mark on Cain so that no one who finds him will kill him. This is not God pretending the murder did not matter. It is judgment mixed with mercy. Cain does not get to undo what he has done. Abel does not come back. But Cain is not handed over to endless revenge. Then Genesis says Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. That phrase should feel heavy. Cain is not only moving on a map, he is moving deeper into life outside the garden. Adam and Eve were driven east of Eden, and now Cain moves even farther east. Again, this is not a secret code where every direction automatically means one thing. But in early Genesis, movement away from Eden is part of the story's emotional geography. Eden was the place of God's presence, life, blessing, and human vocation. Cain goes away from the presence of the Lord. The man who refused to keep his brother now lives as a man who has lost his settled place. He is east of Eden, marked by judgment, protected by mercy, carrying the memory of blood. And this is where Genesis could easily leave him. Cain killed. Cain was judged. Cain wandered. End of story. But Genesis refuses to end there. It gives us one more shocking detail. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And Cain was building a city, and he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Stop there. Cain was sentenced to be a fugitive and a wanderer, and now Cain is building a city. A city is the opposite of wandering. A city is stability. A city is walls, homes, identity, protection, memory, future. A city says, we are not drifting. We have a place. We have a name. We have a center. Cain, the wanderer, builds something that looks like permanence. Cain, the man afraid someone will kill him, builds something that looks like protection. Cain, the man who lost his brother and left the presence of the Lord, names the city after his son. It is as if Cain is trying to create a future that judgment cannot erase. He cannot go back to Eden. He cannot bring Abel back from the ground. He cannot undo the blood in the field. But he can build. He can name. He can make a place. And that is what makes this scene so uncomfortable. The Bible is not saying every city is evil. It is not saying architecture is evil, or community is evil, or culture is evil. The Bible will later give us Jerusalem. The Bible will end with a city. But Genesis makes us notice the first city it names. It rises from Cain's line, east of Eden, after bloodshed, outside the presence of the Lord. That means Cain's city is not just a random historical footnote. It is a mirror. It shows us that human beings can build after sin. We can create after violence. We can make culture, family, walls, names, and futures, even when our hearts are still unresolved before God. That is one of the most unsettling truths in Genesis. Progress and righteousness are not the same thing. Building and healing are not the same thing. A city can rise while blood still cries from the ground. Cain's life does not become empty after his sin. It becomes productive. That is what makes it darker. If Cain simply disappeared into nothing, the story would be easier. But he does not. He builds. He names. He begins a line. And the line grows. The question becomes, what kind of world grows from Cain's city? Before we go further, I want to ask you something. When Cain builds the city, do you see it more as fear, pride, or survival? Comment one word. Fear, pride, or survival? Because the answer you choose says a lot about how you read Cain. Was he trying to protect himself from violence? Was he trying to make a name after losing his place? Was he trying to survive outside Eden? Or was it all happening at once? Genesis does not flatten Cain into a cartoon villain. It shows us something more uncomfortable, a guilty man who is still capable of building a world. After Cain builds the city, Genesis does not slow down to give us a full biography. It moves through his descendants quickly, but the names it gives are not empty. They show that Cain's line becomes a place of cultural development. From Cain comes Enoch. From Enoch comes Irad. Then Mehujael, Methushael, and Lamech. And when Genesis reaches Lamech's family, the story suddenly points to the rise of ordinary human culture. Jabal is called the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. Jubal is called the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. Tubal-Cain is a forger of instruments of bronze and iron, tents, livestock, music, tools, metalwork. This is not a primitive nothingness. This is a growing civilization. People are learning to live, organize, create, craft, play, and shape the world. And again, we have to be careful. Genesis is not saying music is evil. It is not saying metalwork is evil. It is not saying livestock, tents, tools, or culture are evil. These are human gifts. They belong to human vocation. Humanity was created to cultivate the world, to draw out its possibilities, to name, order, create, and fill the earth with life. But Genesis places these gifts inside Cain's line, and that placement creates tension. The issue is not that culture exists. The issue is that culture can grow in a line already marked by violence and distance from God. Skill can grow while wisdom dies. Beauty can grow while brotherhood collapses. Tools can become sharper while the heart becomes harder. Cain's line becomes advanced, but advancement is not the same as redemption. That is one of the most relevant ideas in the whole chapter. We like to believe that if society becomes more developed, it automatically becomes more righteous. More tools, more systems, more art, more cities, more knowledge, more power. Surely that means we are getting better. Genesis is far more honest. It does not deny human creativity. It does not mock culture. But it refuses to confuse progress with salvation. You can have music and murder in the same family line. You can have metalwork and moral collapse in the same civilization. You can build walls high enough to feel safe and still not know how to keep your brother. Cain's line shows us that the human problem is not solved by development alone. The first city can have culture, and still the blood can cry out. That is why the next scene with Lamech is so important. Lamech speaks to his wives, Ada and Zillah, and his words sound like a dark song. Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. This is one of the first pieces of poetry after Eden. And what is it about? Violence. Lamech does not hide his bloodshed like Cain. Cain was evasive. Cain answered God with a question. Cain seemed afraid of what would happen to him. Lamech boasts. He turns violence into identity. He sings about retaliation as if it proves his greatness. And this is the escalation Genesis wants us to feel. In Cain, violence is hidden. In Lamech, violence becomes a song. In Cain, one brother kills another brother in the field. In Lamech, a man announces that being wounded gives him the right to kill. Cain feared revenge. Lamech celebrates revenge. Cain needed God's protection from sevenfold vengeance. Lamech claims 77-fold vengeance for himself. The line has moved from murder to murder as pride. And now the city, the culture, the tools, and the song sit beside a heart that glorifies violence. This is where the story gets very dark. Cain's family is not presented as useless or stupid. It is talented. It is creative. It is productive. It builds. It makes music. It works metal. It develops forms of life that will be part of human civilization. But inside that development, the old wound grows. The refusal to keep the brother becomes the willingness to kill the stranger. The anger Cain would not rule becomes the violence Lamech celebrates. This is why Genesis 4 is not only the story of one crime. It is the story of sin spreading from the individual to the household, from the household to the city, from the city to culture, and from culture into a world where violence can become normal. The Bible is showing us a terrifying possibility. Human beings can become more capable without becoming more holy. And when capability grows without righteousness, the world does not become safe. It becomes more dangerous. Then Genesis turns and gives another line. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enoch. At that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. That ending is easy to pass over, but it is one of the most important contrasts in the chapter. Cain builds a city and names it after his son. In the line of Seth, people begin to call upon the name of the Lord. One line builds a name, the other calls on the name. Again, this does not mean everyone in Cain's line is a monster, or everyone in Seth's line is automatically righteous in every way. Genesis is not that flat. But the narrative contrast is there. Outside Eden, human beings face a choice. Will they build identity around their own name, their own city, their own security, their own vengeance, or will they call on the name of the Lord? Cain names the city after Enoch, perhaps trying to give his family permanence. Seth's line calls on the Lord, recognizing that human life outside Eden cannot heal itself by building alone. And this contrast does not stay in Genesis 4. It keeps growing. By Genesis 6, the earth is filled with violence. That word matters. The problem before the flood is not described only as private immorality. The earth is corrupt, and the earth is filled with violence. Cain's story introduced bloodshed between brothers. Lamech turned violence into a boast. By the time of the flood, violence has filled the earth. We should not say Cain alone caused the flood. Genesis does not say that. But Cain's story gives us the first note of the song that later becomes deafening. Blood cries from the ground in Genesis 4. Violence fills the earth in Genesis 6. The family problem becomes a world problem. What began in a field does not stay in the field. After the flood, humanity gets a new beginning with Noah. But the problem does not disappear. Soon the nations spread, and then Genesis gives us another city story. Babel. The people gather and say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Suddenly, the echoes are hard to ignore. Cain builds a city after leaving God's presence. Babel builds a city and tower to make a name. Cain names his city after his son. Babel wants a name for ourselves. Cain, the wanderer, builds for stability. Babel fears being scattered. Cain's city is not Babel yet, but it feels like the first note of the same song. Human beings outside Eden keep trying to secure life through building, naming, gathering, and controlling. And again, the problem is not building itself. The problem is building as a substitute for trust. The problem is making a name because we do not want to receive one. The problem is using human strength to escape dependence on God. That is why Cain's city matters for the whole Bible. It is not just a strange line in a genealogy. It is the beginning of a question that the Bible keeps asking. What kind of city are human beings building? Is it a city where the strong protect the weak, or a city where Lamech boasts over the wounded? Is it a city that remembers the blood in the field, or a city that buries it under walls and music? Is it a city built to serve life, or a city built to make a name? The Bible is not anti-city. That would be too simple. It is far more powerful than that. The Bible begins in a garden, but it does not end by deleting the city. It ends with a city redeemed. The final vision is the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven, a city where God dwells with his people, where death is no more, mourning and crying and pain are no more, and the nations walk by its light. That is the astonishing ending. The answer to Cain's city is not no city. The answer is God's city. So the Bible gives us two city stories standing at opposite ends of the canon. Cain's city rises east of Eden, built by a man running from blood, fear, judgment, and exile. The final city comes down from God, filled with life, healing, presence, and light. Cain's city is named by a man trying to establish a future outside the garden. God's city is the future God gives when he makes all things new. Cain's city belongs to a world where brothers kill brothers. God's city belongs to a world where the curse is no more. And between those two cities, the Bible keeps asking whether human beings will build in pride, fear, and violence, or receive life from the God whose presence is the only true center. That changes how we read Cain. He is not only the first murderer, he is the first picture of a human being trying to build after judgment, trying to establish life after losing his way, trying to make something permanent outside the presence he left behind. And that should disturb us because Cain is not as far away as we want him to be. We know what it is like to build over guilt. We know what it is like to keep moving so we do not have to face the blood on the ground. We know what it is like to make work, success, family, art, money, reputation, or achievement into a city strong enough to protect us from the truth. We know what it is like to want a name, a place, a future, and security while avoiding the question God asked at the beginning. Where is your brother? That question still stands under every city we build. Where is your brother? Where is the one you ignored? Where is the one you wounded? Where is the one whose life became inconvenient to your ambition? Cain answered, "Am I my brother's keeper?" But the rest of the Bible moves toward a different answer. Yes. Human life is not meant to be built on the denial of responsibility. A city that forgets the brother will eventually become a city of Lamech. A culture that celebrates skill without mercy will eventually turn its tools into weapons and its songs into boasts. But the story does not end there. The same Bible that shows Cain's city also shows God moving toward a city where violence is finally healed, where the nations are gathered without Babel's pride, where human culture is not erased but purified, where the kings of the earth bring their glory into the presence of God. So after killing Abel, Cain built the Bible's first city. That is not just a shocking detail. It is a warning. It tells us that human beings can build impressive things while still running from God. It tells us that civilization can rise east of Eden while blood still cries from the ground. It tells us that progress without repentance cannot save us. But it also prepares us for the hope at the end of the Bible. The first city Genesis names is built by Cain, east of Eden. But the last city in the Bible is filled with the presence of God. Cain's city begins with blood in the ground. God's city ends with every tear wiped away. The story does not end with the murderer's city. It ends with the city of the living God.